Ever wondered why people cling to beliefs, even when they're contradicted by reality?
You've brought us a fascinating book to explore. When Prophecy Fails, a deep dive into the psychology of belief and the surprising ways people react when their convictions clash with undeniable facts.
It's like that mental tug-of-war that happens when you know you should eat healthy, but you really want that slice of cake.
And When Prophecy Fails examines this phenomenon in the context of groups who made predictions about the end of the world, predictions that turned out to be wrong.
It's almost as if the failed prophecies strengthen their resolve.
That's a powerful way to put it. And to understand why, we need to consider the 5 conditions that make cognitive dissonance a powerful force in shaping our beliefs and actions.
Let's break down how these conditions create the perfect storm for dissonance.
First, you need a strong belief. This isn't just a passing opinion. It's something deeply held, a core part of someone's worldview.
So it's not just about a belief, it's about the strength of the belief.
Yeah.
And what's the next ingredient?
Public commitment. They've shared this belief publicly, maybe even taken actions based on it. It's much harder to back down when you've put yourself out there.
It's like admitting you were wrong in front of everyone. It's difficult to swallow your pride and change course.
Absolutely. Now, here's where things get really interesting. The belief has to be specific and testable, something that can be proven or disproven, like a date for the apocalypse, for example, not a vague notion of bad things happening.
So it's about having a specific prediction that can be tested against reality.
Mhm.
What happens when that prediction fails?
That's the 4th condition, undeniable disconfirmation. The predicted event doesn't happen, no wiggle room for interpretation.
Everyone can see it didn't happen. So do they just give up their belief at that point?
Not necessarily. That's where the 5th condition comes in. Social support. When a group of people share the same belief, they can reinforce each other's convictions and help to rationalize away any disconfirming evidence.
It's like they need that shared belief to cope with the dissonance, to create a sense of belonging and validation.
Exactly. And in these situations, people often reduce dissonance not by abandoning their belief, but by finding ways to explain it away, or by doubling down on proselytizing, trying to convert others to their cause. It's a classic example of cognitive dissonance in action.
That's where things really get intriguing. How do these groups justify their failed prophecies? How do they convince others to join their cause?
Well, let's jump into our first case study, the Sabbateans of the 17th century, a group centered around a man named Sabbatai Zevi.
Tell us about this fascinating figure. This sounds like something straight out of a captivating true crime podcast.
To understand the Sabbateans, we need to consider the context of their time. They were living in a period of intense religious fervor amidst a backdrop of Jewish mysticism and a longing for the arrival of a Messiah who would usher in an era of peace and redemption.
So the stage was set for someone to capture their imaginations with a bold prediction.
And that's exactly what Sabbatai Zevi did. He declared himself the Messiah and predicted his arrival and the beginning of a new age in 1648. This wasn't just a fringe belief. It spread like wildfire throughout Jewish communities in Europe and the Middle East.
People must have been on the edge of their seats with anticipation. What happened when 1648 arrived?
Well, as you might expect, the world didn't change overnight. There were no grand miracles, no sweeping redemption. However, instead of acknowledging the failed prediction, Zevi's followers found ways to rationalize it. Some claimed the timing was off, others suggested there were hidden meanings in his prophecies.
That's a fascinating paradox. It seems counterintuitive that their belief would strengthen after such a clear disconfirmation.
It's the power of cognitive dissonance at work. They had invested so much in this belief, publicly declared their allegiance, that simply abandoning it was unthinkable. Zevi's followers adjusted their expectations, reinterpreting events to fit their existing beliefs. It's a common thread we see across many of these cases.
So they doubled down, finding ways to make sense of the dissonance. Did this pattern continue?
It did. Zevi later predicted the Messianic age would begin in 1666. And once again, his followers prepared for a momentous transformation. Some even sold their possessions, convinced the world as they knew it was coming to an end.
This is where we see the human element of these stories really coming through. The hopes, the anxieties, the very real sacrifices people made based on their beliefs.
Absolutely. These weren't just abstract ideas. They had tangible consequences for the people who held them. And when 1666 also passed without incident, it led to a wave of disillusionment for some, but for others, their belief only intensified. It's a testament to the powerful hold these beliefs can have on individuals and communities.
This pattern of doubling down on beliefs after disconfirmation isn't unique to the Sabbateans. Let's look at another group, the Millerites, who emerged in America in the 19th century.
The Millerites offer another compelling example of this phenomenon. William Miller, a Baptist preacher, predicted the world would end in 1843 based on his interpretations of biblical prophecy.
It's hard to imagine the level of anticipation and fear surrounding Miller's prophecy. How many people were caught up in this movement?
Miller amassed a significant following. Thousands of people were captivated by his teachings, drawn in by his fervor and his detailed calculations. And like the Sabbateans, many Millerites took concrete actions based on their belief in the impending apocalypse.
What kind of actions are we talking about?
People sold their belongings, gave away their money, and prepared for ascension. They wanted to be ready when the day of judgment arrived. There's a certain human drama to these stories, a stark reminder that beliefs have consequences.
So, what happened when 1843 came and went and the world kept spinning?
It was a defining moment for the Millerites. Just as with the Sabbateans, the failed prediction didn't shatter their belief system. Instead, they rationalized. Miller adjusted his calculations, eventually settling on a new date in 1844.
It's almost as if they shifted their understanding of the prophecy, reinterpreting events to maintain their core belief.
Exactly. This highlights a key element of dissonance reduction, shifting the belief slightly to accommodate the new information rather than abandoning it entirely. It's a way to preserve the core conviction while explaining away the discrepancy.
And of course, 1844 also passed without a cataclysmic event.
Indeed, leading to what became known as the Great Disappointment. But even in the face of this second disconfirmation, many Millerites clung to their beliefs. Some argued that the Second Coming had occurred, but it was a spiritual event, not a physical one.
It's a powerful example of how cognitive dissonance can lead to elaborate rationalizations in order to protect cherished beliefs.
Precisely. The Millerites, like the Sabbateans before them, demonstrate how individuals and groups grapple with the tension between their deeply held convictions and undeniable reality.
These stories, while fascinating in their own right, also offer a window into the broader human experience. They remind us that we're all capable of holding on to beliefs, even when confronted with contradictory evidence.
And when prophecy fails, takes us even deeper into this phenomenon by examining a group that was studied in real time. This is where things get even more intriguing.
Let's delve into that case study. Tell us about Marion Keech and the Seekers. So we left off with Marion Keech and her group, the Seekers, who were awaiting a cataclysmic flood on December 21st, 1954. And what makes this case so interesting is that researchers were actually able to study the Seekers in real time as these events unfolded.
Yeah, they were right there in the thick of it. When Prophecy Fails really digs into those observations and interviews, giving us that fly-on-the-wall perspective of how a group handles it when their deeply held belief crashes and burns.
Okay, so no pressure, but I'm dying to know what happened when December 21st arrived and the world decided not to end.
Well, picture this. The Seekers all gather together. You know, the tension is so thick you could cut it with a knife, right? Waiting for this massive flood and their escape on a spaceship, no less. Midnight rolls around. Nothing. And their reactions, well, it was a mix of shock and just complete bewilderment.
I can only imagine. Talk about having the rug pulled out from under you. How do you even begin to make sense of that?
And that, my friend, is the million-dollar question, isn't it? That's the heart of cognitive dissonance. Because instead of saying, well, I guess we were wrong, the Seekers, with Keech leading the charge, started scrambling for explanations.
So they rationalized it.
Exactly. Some clung to the idea that their faith had actually prevented the flood. Others figured it was a test from, the powers that be to see how committed they really were. And then there were those who were convinced that they had just misinterpreted the messages somehow, maybe gotten the timeline wrong.
Wow. It really shows you the lengths people will go to hold on to what they believe, even when the evidence is staring them right in the face. Did any of these explanations actually work? Did they bring the Seekers any comfort?
For some, those explanations were enough. It allowed them to reconcile what happened with their worldview. But here's the real kicker. Instead of slinking off into the night, the Seekers actually doubled down on their proselytizing.
Wait, really? That's wild. Their prophecy was a bust, and yet they became even more determined to spread their message. Why?
Classic dissonance reduction. By trying to convert others, they were trying to validate their own beliefs, like, hey, if we can get other people to believe this, then maybe we weren't so wrong after all.
So they needed to convince others to convince themselves. Did they have any luck?
They did get a bit of media attention, newspapers and radio shows picking up their story, but attracting a huge following, not so much.
I can imagine. Even with all that effort, it must have been tough to completely ignore the reality that they were wrong. Did everyone stick with the group?
That's the other fascinating thing here. The researchers noticed that social support was absolutely crucial in keeping the belief alive. Those who stayed closely knit with the core group, surrounded by people who shared their convictions, were far more likely to cling to the belief.
Like an echo chamber for their beliefs. So what about the people who didn't have that kind of support system?
Yeah, the ones who drifted from the group, who didn't have that constant reinforcement, they were the ones who started having doubts, who began to question everything. Shows you just how powerful social dynamics are when it comes to shaping what we believe.
It's a good reminder that our beliefs aren't formed in a bubble. Our
No.
social circles, our culture, even the information we choose to consume, it all plays a role.
Absolutely. And when prophecy fails with these captivating case studies, really forces us to look at the complexities of belief. What happens psychologically when we're challenged, how we rationalize, how we justify, and ultimately how desperately we try to cling to our worldview.
It's been a fascinating deep dive for sure. And for me, the big takeaway is the sheer power of cognitive dissonance. Doomsday cults or just everyday decisions, it's at work, subtly shaping our thoughts and actions.
It's a good reality check for all of us. None of us are immune to it. We all have beliefs we're scared to let go of. Beliefs we'll bend over backwards to defend, even when we're faced with evidence to the contrary.
A good reminder to think critically, to question what we think we know, and maybe even be brave enough to admit when we're wrong, right?
Couldn't agree more. When Prophecy Fails is a timeless look at these deeply human tendencies, and it's definitely worth a read.
To our listeners, thanks for bringing us this book. It's been quite the journey exploring these fascinating corners of the human mind. And if you want to dig deeper, be sure to check out When Prophecy Fails.